October 1943. Somewhere over the North Sea, a young aerial gunner watches a Fokker-Wulf peel away after its third pass. His twin 50s are blazing. The tracer stream arcs beautifully into empty air. He leads the target, compensates for speed, pulls the trigger with conviction, and misses. Again. The mathematics of deflection shooting are brutal. The human eye is not built for this kind of geometry at 400 miles per hour. By war's end, less than 1% of aerial gunners will ever confirm a kill, but one man is about to change that. The sky over occupied Europe is a killing floor. Every day, hundreds of American bombers push deep into German airspace. They fly in tight formations, bristling with 50-caliber machine guns. The doctrine is simple: mutual defense through overlapping fire. The theory is sound. The execution is something else entirely. Luftwaffe fighters come in fast. They close to 300 yards, sometimes less, then break away in a scissors maneuver that leaves gunners spinning. The closing speed is staggering. A Messerschmitt 109 at full throttle closes the gap at nearly 600 miles per hour relative velocity. That gives a gunner maybe 2 seconds to acquire, lead, and fire. Most never hit anything. The guns themselves are magnificent. The Browning M2 can spit 600 rounds per minute. Each bullet weighs nearly 2 ounces. At range, it can punch through an engine block, but only if it connects. And connection requires deflection shooting, a discipline that asks the human brain to calculate angles, speed differentials, and ballistic drop in the span of a heartbeat. The Army Air Forces trains its gunners as best it can. They practice on ground ranges with moving targets. They study diagrams. They memorize lead angles for various approach vectors. But nothing prepares them for the reality of combat at 25,000 feet, where the air is thin, the cold burns exposed skin, and fear makes the hands shake. The results are dismal. Post-mission analysis reveals that gunners expend thousands of rounds per confirmed kill. Some crews burn through their entire ammunition load without ever seeing a tracer connect. It is not a failure of courage. It is a failure of geometry. The human eye simply cannot track a target moving that fast while compensating for wind, gravity, and the motion of the bomber itself. Engineers try to help. They develop ring and bead sights, crude devices that offer reference points for lead angles. They issue tables and charts. They refine training protocols. None of it makes much difference. The math is too complex. The time window is too narrow. And the price of failure is measured in burning fuselages and men who never make it home. By the autumn of 1943, the 8th Air Force is losing bombers faster than factories can replace them. Entire squadrons are chewed apart over Schweinfurt and Regensburg. Fighter escorts help, but their range is limited. Deep into Germany, the bombers fly alone. Their only defense is the guns, and the guns are not enough. Somewhere in this mechanical storm, a staff sergeant named Louis Pejsa is beginning to notice a pattern. He is not a theorist. He is not an engineer. He is a gunner on a B-24 Liberator, and he has spent enough missions watching his tracers miss to understand that something fundamental is broken. If you want more such stories, like and subscribe so these lives aren't forgotten. Louis Pejsa grew up in a place where precision mattered. He was born in rural Wisconsin, the son of immigrants who worked the land with the kind of quiet intensity that shapes a child's sense of problem-solving. Nothing was wasted. Every tool had a purpose. If something broke, you fixed it. If it could not be fixed, you built a replacement. Pejsa learned early that the world responded to logic, not hope. Before the war, he worked in a machine shop. The job required exactitude, tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch, components that had to fit together with no room for approximation. He learned to read blueprints, to visualize three-dimensional objects from two-dimensional drawings, to think in terms of vectors and forces. It was not glamorous work, but it taught him how systems functioned and, more importantly, how they failed. When the draft came, Pejsa did not resist. He was not the type to chase glory, but he understood duty. The Army Air Forces assigned him to gunnery school. He excelled, not because he was naturally gifted with a trigger, but because he approached the weapon as a mechanical problem. He studied the ballistics. He noted the discrepancies between the training ranges and the combat footage he saw in briefings. He began to suspect that the official methods were flawed. In combat, the suspicion became certainty. His first missions over Germany were a baptism in futility. He manned the waist gun on a Liberator named Devil's Advocate, part of the 446th Bomb Group, stationed in East Anglia. The aircraft smelled of oil, sweat, and cordite. The noise was overwhelming. At altitude, the cold turned metal into ice and fingers into clumsy clubs. And when the fighters came, the world collapsed into a blur of speed and panic. Pejsa fired. He watched his tracers arc away into nothing. He adjusted his lead. He fired again. Still nothing. The other gunners were no better. They poured fire into the sky with desperate determination and almost no effect. After each mission, the crew would gather for debriefing. Gunners would claim hits. Intelligence officers would nod politely. But the gun camera footage told a different story. Most of the time, they were not even close. Pejsa did not blame his crewmates. The problem was not effort. It was method. The standard ring-and-bead sight was a relic of slower wars. It assumed the gunner could visually estimate range and lead angle, then hold that lead while firing. But the human eye is not a rangefinder. Depth perception fails at distance. A fighter at 400 yards looks almost identical to one at 600, and the lead angle changes dramatically with range. At 300 yards, you might lead a crossing target by 2 plane lengths. At 600, it is more like 5. Guess wrong, and every bullet misses. Worse, the sight offered no compensation for gravity. A .50 caliber bullet drops significantly over distance. At 1,000 yards, the drop is measured in feet. The gunner is supposed to account for this instinctively, adjusting the sight picture based on range and angle. In practice, it is an impossible ask. Pejsa started taking notes. After each mission, he would sketch the attack angles. He would estimate ranges based on the size of the enemy aircraft in his sight picture. He would note where his tracers went versus where the target was. Slowly, a pattern emerged. The standard doctrine was teaching gunners to aim where the target was going to be. But it was not accounting for all the variables. The method was incomplete. One night, back at the barracks, Pejsa sat down with a pencil and a notebook. He began working through the math, trigonometry, ballistics, relative motion. He was not a trained mathematician, but he understood machines, and a bullet in flight is just a machine obeying the laws of physics. If you could predict where it would go, you could aim accordingly. The other gunners thought he was wasting his time. Some ribbed him gently. Others ignored him. No one believed that a sergeant from Wisconsin was going to solve a problem that had stumped Army Air Forces engineers for years. Pejsa kept calculating. The 8th Air Force was bleeding. By the winter of 1943, the losses were unsustainable. Missions over Germany were costly beyond any pre-war projection. On October 14th, Black Thursday, the Schweinfurt raid cost 60 bombers and over 600 men. The Luftwaffe was not invincible, but it was effective. Its pilots were experienced, its tactics were evolving, and the American bombers, for all their firepower, were struggling to defend themselves. The problem was visible in every after-action report. Gunners were firing vast quantities of ammunition with minimal results. The 50 caliber Browning was lethal, but only if the bullets arrived at the same point in space as the target. And that required deflection, shooting so precise that most gunners could not execute it under combat conditions. The official training program tried to address this. Gunners practiced on skeet ranges, tracking clay pigeons, and learning to lead moving targets. They studied recognition silhouettes. They memorized approach angles and prescribed lead distances. The curriculum was thorough. The results were not. The issue was fundamental. Human perception is not designed for the speeds and distances involved in aerial combat. When a Focke-Wulf 190 comes screaming in at 400 miles per hour, the brain struggles to process the motion. The target appears to drift lazily across the field of view, but that drift is deceptive. It represents hundreds of feet per second of actual movement. By the time the gunner pulls the trigger, the target is already somewhere else. Engineers tried to build better sights. Some experimented with gyroscopic mechanisms that would automatically calculate lead angles. Others explored optical rangefinders. A few proposed electronic computing sights that could factor in speed, range, and trajectory. But these systems were complex, heavy, and prone to failure. And none of them were ready for mass production. Meanwhile, bombers kept falling. Commanders pushed for tighter formations, believing that concentrated fire would compensate for individual inaccuracy. It helped, but only marginally. The Luftwaffe adapted, developing head-on attacks that minimized exposure time. German fighters would come in fast from 12 o'clock high, fire a burst, and break away before the gunners could react. The closing speed was too great. The window of opportunity was too narrow. Some crews tried modifications. A few gunners removed the standard sights entirely, relying on instinct and tracer feedback. Others painted reference marks on their turret glass, improvising aiming points based on personal experience. These efforts were scattered and uncoordinated. There was no central doctrine for improvement, no systematic approach to solving the deflection problem. Pejsa watched all of this with growing frustration. He understood the mechanics of the failure. The standard sight assumed a flat trajectory and relied on the gunner to estimate lead based on visual cues. But the trajectory was not flat. Gravity pulled the bullet down. Air resistance slowed it. At long range, these factors were significant. A bullet fired at a target 600 yards away would drop several feet by the time it arrived. If the gunner did not account for that drop, the rounds would pass harmlessly below the target. The doctrine told gunners to aim high to compensate. But how high? The answer depended on range, and range was nearly impossible to judge accurately in combat. A Messerschmitt 109 is 30 feet long. At 400 yards, it fills a certain portion of the sight picture. At 600 yards, it fills less. But the difference is subtle, especially when the aircraft is maneuvering and the gunner is under fire. Pejsa began sketching a solution. He started with basic physics. A bullet leaves the muzzle at 2,900 feet per second. Gravity accelerates it downward at 32 feet per second squared. Air resistance decelerates it horizontally. If you knew the range to the target, you could calculate exactly how much the bullet would drop and how much it would slow down. From there, you could determine the precise aiming point needed to hit a moving target. The math was not simple, but it was solvable. Pejsa worked through it in his notebook, filling pages with equations and diagrams. He cross-referenced ballistic tables. He factored in the rate of traverse for different attack angles. He built a model that accounted for every variable he could identify. Then he did something unusual. He built a physical sight. Using materials scavenged from the base, he constructed a crude aiming device. It was not elegant. It consisted of a metal frame with adjustable reference points, calibrated to the ballistic drop of a 50 caliber round at various ranges. The idea was simple. Instead of guessing the lead angle, the gunner would align the target with a specific reference mark based on estimated range. The sight would automatically factor in gravity and trajectory. It looked like something cobbled together in a garage. The other gunners were polite but skeptical. One remarked that it resembled a coat hanger welded to a protractor. Pejsa did not argue. He just asked for a chance to test it. His crew chief was reluctant. Modifying military equipment without authorization was technically against regulations. But the war was not being won by following regulations. After some persuasion, the chief agreed to let Pejsa mount the device on the waist gun for one mission. If it worked, fine. If it caused problems, it would come off immediately. Pejsa agreed to the terms. The test came on a cold morning in late November. The target was Bremen. The mission brief was routine, which meant dangerous but not suicidal. Intelligence expected moderate fighter resistance. The weather was poor, with heavy cloud cover over the channel and broken visibility over the continent. The formation would be tight. Gunners were reminded to watch their fields of fire and avoid shooting into friendly aircraft. Pejsa mounted his improvised sight before dawn. It attached to the gun mount with bolts and wire, a ugly contraption that drew curious glances from the ground crew. One mechanic asked if it was some kind of good luck charm. Pejsa just shook his head and climbed into the aircraft. The flight out was uneventful. The Liberator droned east over the North Sea, engines hammering in steady rhythm. At altitude, the cold was savage. Ice formed on the gun barrels. Breath condensed into clouds. Pejsa flexed his fingers inside his gloves, keeping the circulation going. He checked the sight one more time, making sure the reference marks were aligned. The fighters came an hour into German airspace. They appeared as dark specks against the clouds, then resolved into Focke-Wulf 190s. 6 of them, diving in pairs from the port side. The formation tightened. The lead bomber fired a flare. Then the sky erupted. Pejsa swung his gun to track the first fighter. It was coming in fast, nose slightly high, exhaust trailing smoke. Range roughly 500 yards and closing. He positioned the target against the second reference mark on his sight, the one calibrated for that distance. The fighter slid into alignment. Pejsa led it by the calculated amount, feeling the geometry click into place in his mind. He pressed the trigger. The gun roared. Brass casings tumbled into the collection bag. Tracers streaked out in a glowing line. And this time, they did not miss. The rounds walked up the fighter's wing root. There was a bright flash. A piece of the cowling tore away. The Focke-Wulf rolled hard left and peeled off, trailing smoke. Pejsa did not wait to confirm. The second fighter was already in his sights. He adjusted for the new angle, aligned the reference mark, and fired again. Another hit, this one stitched across the canopy. The fighter's nose dropped. It went into a shallow dive and disappeared into the clouds. The engagement lasted less than a minute. By the time the German fighters broke off, Pejsa had expended 200 rounds and scored hits on 2 aircraft. It was not a miracle. It was math. The sight worked, but the real proof came later. After landing, the crew gathered for debriefing. The intelligence officer asked the gunners for their reports. Most had fired heavily, but claimed no confirmed kills. Pejsa mentioned his 2 hits. The officer made a note, skeptical but professional. Then the gun camera footage was developed. It showed everything. The first fighter struck cleanly at just over 500 yards. The second hit at an angle most gunners would have considered impossible. The tracers converged exactly where Pejsa's sight had predicted. There was no guesswork, no lucky spray, just precision. The crew chief saw the footage and went silent. Then he asked Pejsa how the hell he had done that. Pejsa explained the sight. He showed the calculations. He walked the chief through the ballistic theory and the reference marks. It was not magic, it was engineering. The sight simply removed the guesswork from deflection shooting. Aim at the right mark for the estimated range, lead by the calculated amount, and the bullets would go where you wanted them to go. Word spread quickly through the squadron. Other gunners asked to see the device. A few were dismissive. Some thought it was a fluke, but a few others, the ones who had spent enough missions watching their rounds miss, recognized what Pejsa had done. He had solved the problem. The squadron commander took notice. He ordered Pejsa to brief the gunnery officer. The briefing was informal, held in a drafty Quonset hut with a blackboard and a pot of bad coffee. Pejsa explained the theory. He demonstrated the sight. He answered questions. The gunnery officer listened, then asked the most important question. Could it be mass-produced? Pejsa thought so. The design was simple. A competent machinist could fabricate one in a few hours. The materials were common. There was no reason it could not be issued to every gunner in the group. The gunnery officer said he would pass the recommendation up the chain. The bureaucracy moved slowly. Pejsa's innovation was noted in official reports. A few engineering officers reviewed the design and acknowledged its potential. But the 8th Air Force was a vast machine, and changes required testing, approval, and logistical coordination. Weeks passed with no word. The war did not wait. Bombers continued to fly, fighters continued to attack, gunners continued to miss. Pejsa flew more missions with his improvised sight. Each time, the results were consistent. He was hitting targets at ranges other gunners considered impossible. On a raid over Osnabrück, he downed a Messerschmitt 110 at an estimated 700 yards. The other gunners saw it happen. The gun camera confirmed it. The footage was grainy but undeniable. A lone gunner with a homemade sight was outperforming the entire squadron. A few others in the group asked Pejsa to build sights for them. He agreed. Working in his spare time, he fabricated crude replicas using scrap metal and tools borrowed from the machine shop. Each sight was slightly different, tailored to the individual gunner's position and weapon mount, but the principle was the same. Adjust for range, lead by the calculated amount. Let the math do the work. The gunners who adopted the sight saw immediate results. Hit rates improved. Fighters that once escaped unscathed now broke off trailing smoke. The effect was measurable. After-action reports began to show a cluster of confirmed kills coming from aircraft equipped with the modified sights. A training officer from 8th Air Force Headquarters visited the squadron in early December. He interviewed Pejsa and examined the sight. He reviewed the gun camera footage. Then he asked Pejsa to conduct a live demonstration. They set up a range on the coast. A tow plane dragged a target sleeve at varying distances and speeds. Pejsa manned a gun mount identical to the one on his bomber. He used his sight to track the target and fired controlled bursts. The results were documented. At ranges exceeding 800 yards, Pejsa was achieving hit percentages that exceeded anything the Army Air Forces had seen from a standard sight. The training officer was impressed. He recommended immediate adoption of the design, but recommendations take time to become orders. Meanwhile, Pejsa kept flying. His reputation spread. Pilots began requesting him for their crews. Other squadrons heard about the Wisconsin gunner who never missed. Some thought it was exaggeration, others were curious. A few engineering-minded gunners traveled to the 446th to see the sight for themselves. Pejsa showed them everything. He shared his calculations. He explained the theory. He did not hoard the knowledge. He understood that one gunner hitting targets was useful. 100 gunners hitting targets could change the war. By late December, a small network of gunners across the 8th Air Force were using variations of Pejsa's design. They fabricated their own sights, adapted the math to their specific weapons, and shared the results. It was an organic, grassroots innovation happening outside official channels. The Air Force had not authorized it, but the Air Force was not stopping it either. Then came the mission over Ludwigshafen. It was January 1944. The target was a chemical plant deep in western Germany. The Luftwaffe response was fierce. Fighters swarmed the formation from multiple angles, coordinated and aggressive. Pejsa's bomber was hit early. An engine caught fire. The pilot fought to keep the aircraft in formation, but the Liberator was losing altitude. The fighters smelled blood. They came in for the kill. Pejsa fired steadily, working through the attackers one by one. His sight allowed him to track targets even as the bomber shuddered and yawed. He hit a Focke-Wulf head-on at nearly 1,000 yards, an absurd distance for aerial gunnery. The fighter disintegrated. He shifted to another target, adjusted for the range, and fired again. Another hit. The German fighters hesitated, breaking off sooner than usual. The bomber limped home on 3 engines. The gun camera footage from that mission became legendary. It showed a level of accuracy that should not have been possible. Officers who reviewed it assumed the camera was malfunctioning or the ranges were miscalculated. But the math checked out. Pejsa had hit a fighter at nearly 1,000 yards using a sight he built in a machine shop. That was the moment the Air Force could no longer ignore him. In February 1944, the 8th Air Force issued a technical order authorizing field modifications to gunnery sights based on Pejsa's design. It was not a full adoption. The official procurement process would take months, but squadron armorers were given permission to fabricate and install the sights using locally available materials. Engineering schematics were distributed. Training officers began incorporating deflection shooting principles based on Pejsa's calculations into the curriculum. The results were immediate and measurable. Hit rates across the 8th Air Force began to climb. Gunners equipped with the modified sights were downing fighters at ranges previously considered beyond effective engagement distance. Luftwaffe pilots noticed. German after-action reports from early 1944 mention increased defensive fire accuracy from American bombers. Some pilots began breaking off attacks earlier, unwilling to press into what had become unexpectedly lethal airspace. The shift was not total. Many gunners continued using standard sights, either due to supply issues or personal preference, but enough adopted the new method that the aggregate effect was significant. Bomber loss rates began to decline, not dramatically, but noticeably. Every mission that returned with fewer casualties was a mission that kept crews alive and kept bombers in the fight. Pejsa himself completed his tour in March 1944. 35 missions, no wounds, multiple confirmed kills. He was rotated back to the United States and assigned to a training unit where he taught deflection shooting to new gunners. The homemade sight was no longer a curiosity. It was doctrine. By mid-1944, refined versions of the sight were being manufactured stateside and shipped to combat units. Engineers improved the design, making it more durable and easier to install. But the core principle remained unchanged. It was still Pejsa's math, still his insight that the human eye needed help, and that help could come from understanding the physics of the problem. The long-term impact is difficult to quantify precisely. The Air Force did not track kills by sight type, but post-war analysis of gunnery effectiveness shows a marked improvement in hit rates beginning in early 1944, coinciding with the widespread adoption of modified deflection sights. Training officers credited the improvement to better doctrine and equipment. They were half right. The equipment was better because one sergeant had refused to accept that missing was inevitable. Other innovations followed. The K-13 Gunsight, introduced later in the war, incorporated electronic computing elements. The post-war K-14 went further, automating much of the deflection calculation. These systems were more sophisticated than Pejsa's original design, but they owed their existence to the same realization, that gunnery was a solvable problem, not a matter of luck. Pejsa's contribution was not the final word. It was the first word, the proof that an individual working outside the system could identify a critical flaw and fix it. The Air Force had thousands of engineers, dozens of research programs, and vast resources. But it took a staff sergeant with a notebook and a welder to show them what they were missing. The Luftwaffe never fully adapted to the increased accuracy. By late 1944, German fighter strength was declining due to fuel shortages, pilot attrition, and the arrival of long-range American escorts. The air war shifted decisively in favor of the Allies. But in the crucial months of 1943 and early 1944, when the outcome was uncertain and the losses were staggering, Pejsa's sight gave American gunners a tangible edge. How many lives it saved is impossible to say, but the crews who used it knew. They knew that hitting a target at 600 yards instead of 300 meant the fighter broke off sooner. They knew that downing an attacker before it could fire its guns meant fewer holes in the fuselage and fewer friends who did not come home. They knew that precision mattered, and that precision came from understanding the problem rather than hoping for luck. After the war, Pejsa returned to Wisconsin. He went back to work in a machine shop. He did not seek recognition. He did not write memoirs or give lectures. He had done what needed to be done, and that was enough. For decades, his contribution remained largely unknown outside a small circle of veterans and historians. In the years after the war, aerial gunnery faded as a discipline. Jet fighters made gun turrets obsolete. Missiles replaced machine guns. The kind of close-range dogfighting that defined World War II became a relic of the past. But the principle Pejsa uncovered, the idea that human perception could be enhanced through precise calculation and purpose-built tools, endured. Modern weapons systems are built on that principle. Fire control computers, targeting pods, and heads-up displays all exist to do what Pejsa's homemade sight did: remove guesswork and let the operator focus on execution. The technology has advanced beyond recognition. The logic remains the same. Pejsa himself lived quietly. He rarely spoke about the war. When fellow veterans asked about his service, he would mention the missions, the cold, the crew he flew with. He did not dwell on the sight. To him, it was not a stroke of genius. It was just the obvious solution to a mechanical problem. That anyone had overlooked it for so long was the real mystery. In the 1980s, a researcher compiling a history of aerial gunnery uncovered references to Pejsa's work in archived mission reports. Curious, the researcher tracked him down. By then, Pejsa was in his 60s, still working with machines, still thinking in terms of angles and forces. He agreed to an interview. He explained the math. He sketched the sight from memory. He spoke without bravado or false modesty, just a machinist describing a tool he had built because the standard tool was inadequate. The researcher asked if he ever felt vindicated when the Air Force adopted his design. Pejsa thought about it. He said he was glad it helped. He wished it had come sooner. But vindication was not the point. The point was solving the problem. Recognition was irrelevant. What mattered was that gunners stopped missing and bombers stopped falling. That mindset, the relentless focus on function over credit, defined his war and his life. He did not invent deflection shooting. He did not revolutionize aeronautics. He simply noticed that the existing method was flawed and that the flaw was correctable. Then he corrected it. And in doing so, he gave thousands of young men a better chance of surviving a war that devoured them by the hundreds. Louis Pejsa died in 1993. His obituary did not mention the Gunsight. It listed his family, his trade, his community involvement. He was remembered as a good neighbor, a skilled craftsman, a man who fixed things, which is exactly what he was. But in the archives of the 8th Air Force, in the gun camera footage from 100 forgotten missions, his work endures. Every tracer that found its mark because a gunner used a calculated sight instead of a guess. Every fighter that broke off because the defensive fire was suddenly impossibly accurate. Every crew that made it home because one man decided that missing was unacceptable. War is often understood through the actions of generals and the movements of armies. But it is also shaped by individuals who see a problem, understand its mechanics, and refuse to accept that it cannot be solved. Pejsa was not a hero in the cinematic sense. He did not charge into danger or sacrifice himself for others. He simply thought carefully, built precisely, and shared freely. That kind of heroism does not announce itself. It works quietly, in machine shops and notebook margins, in the hands of young men who deserved better tools than they were given. It does not demand monuments. It leaves behind only results. Missions flown, lives saved, a war incrementally turned by the accumulation of small, unglamorous innovations. The sky over Europe is silent now. The bombers are gone. The gunners are gone. But the lesson remains. Logic and courage are not separate virtues. They are partners. And when combined with the willingness to act outside the boundaries of authority and convention, they become a force that reshapes what is possible. One man, one sight, one idea that should have been obvious but was not. That is how wars are won. Not in grand gestures, but in the slow, persistent refusal to accept that the way things are is the way they must be. Pejsa understood that, and in understanding it, he changed the air war, one precise calculation at a time.